Good morning, beautiful children, and welcome back to another chapter of The Birchbark House by Louise Erdrich. And in our story so far, Omakayas and her family, it is winter, and they've had a bit of bad luck. First, a visitor came to the village with the people, and unfortunately, they had smallpox, and many of the native people got sick from it and died. And then her little brother passed away from the smallpox, and a very good friend of Angeline's as well. So on top of that very sad luck, they also did not have a lot of food for the winter, and so they were going hungry, very hungry. And uh, Grandma had a dream about a deer, that the deer was giving its life so the family could live. And sure enough, there was a deer, and they were able to hunt the deer and have the deer for food. And they honored the deer by sprinkling tobacco. And the family was still quite sad, not doing very, I mean, their stomachs were now nourished and they had food, but their souls were still hurting after the loss of so many people with the illness. And it was Pinch who helped bring the family some joy and happiness. Because there's always joy and happiness. There will always be joy and happiness. We must look for it. And little Pinch brought it to his family by getting too close to the fire, and his pants got on fire. And then he went and sat in a bucket full of water, and the family laughed and laughed, and it had been the first time that they'd all laughed in quite some time. And so it was Pinch who helped nourish the family's soul. So we are getting close to the end of this story of Omakayas and her family, and we started, and it was the fall, and then we went through winter with them, and um, in the fall when they were doing ricing and they were getting ready and trying to store food for the winter. And then the winter came, and with all of the things that happened with the sickness, and they didn't have a good rice crop, and so there were some things. But now it is spring, and the word in her language, in the native language, for this would be zigwam, and it means spring. So spring is finally here. And this chapter is called Maple Sugar Time. And think about that. Maple sugar right from the tree. That's where syrup comes, maple sugar comes from. Okay, here we go. Everyone in the cabin heard it. The far-off creaking and groaning, the boom of the lake ice. The lake had started to move again. The ice was breaking up. Once the waves began, huge sheets of ice shoved against each other, pushing towers into the air. Grandma, Mama, Father, Pinch, Angeline, and Omakayas all ran outside, gazed on the horizon, and saw the crackling and snapping of waves of ice. They felt the surge of the lake water in their blood. They knew at last that the back of winter was entirely broken. Omakayas grinned. Her smile was now whole. New teeth had grown in over the winter. She was older. Soon spring plants would poke up through the dead leaves. The curled heads of ferns, buds, roots, fresh new leaves, fat lake trout would sleepily rise from the bottom, hungry to be caught. Other fish would also fill their nets. They would be able to think of something other than their next bite of food. They would live again, truly live again. Angeline went to the mission school every day now. She was learning to write her name in the white man's language, and she taught Omakayas things that she learned. Using a pointed stick to write in wet mud, Angeline showed Omakayas and grandmother the meaningful signs which looked like odd tracks. What animal would leave these? Omakayas teased. Be patient, grandmother counseled. Let's find out what your sister has learned. They're letters, Angeline said, eager to share her knowledge. One follows the next. You look at them just like tracks. You read them. They have meaning and sound. Ha! That's a good idea. Like our picture writing, no, Grandma said. The girls knew people like Fishtail's father, Dave Thunder, who kept the records for the religious gatherings and etched stories and songs on scrolls made of birch bark. They had some they had they had seen some birch bark writing, and they knew that Grandma could etch pictures on bark too. She also knew there were certain marks that had been placed upon lake rocks long ago. Some of the marks were made by the spirits, some were made by the humans, others were drawn by a giant race of people who had lived on earth in the old days and had disappeared. Angeline's description of the white man's tracks interested Omakayas in spite of herself. The system sounded incredible. Sounds, meanings, but the idea, it did make sense. Therefore, to learn these white man's letters and sounds became a source of amusement, for the evenings were still long. Ah, said Angelina, tracing the letters on the rough stone of the hearth. A, A, said Angelina. A, said Omakayas. B, C, D. She learned to make the pictures, and she learned to make the sounds slowly, all of them. Words would follow, Angeline said, but Okomayas could not believe that would happen. She remembered that last winter before the sickness began, she had seen Fishtail walking from the mission school. Had he learned to make the white man's tracks? Had he learned to write his name? Had he learned to read the words of the treaties so that his people could not be cheated from their land? Buzu Minigobaku, said Fishtail one day. He was at the door of the cabin calling hello to his relatives. Grandma greeted him kindly, for he was ashamed of his thinness and weakness. She brought him inside. His hair was short and wild, as a porcupine quill's, his face starved and sallow with grief. No longer did he wear the proud, somewhat disdainful look that he'd worn when walking seriously along through the woods, his pipe cradled in his arms. He was still hawk keen, with a strong and handsome face, but his eyes were more human, humble, gentle. He gazed down at Omakayas and touched her hair. Little frog, he said, and there was a hint of a smile in his voice, as though to see her brought him comfort. My good wife loved you, and her little sister. You made her laugh with her quick ways. She told me you were much loved by the bear people. She told me, also, that you had a bird. Oh, yes, said Omakayas, and like a dark arrow her crow swooped down and landed on her shoulder. The crow looked curiously at Fishtail, wondering whether he possibly had something to feed him. The bird danced from foot to foot, took a strand of Okomaya's hair in his beak, but did not pull. The crow tucked in the hair behind Omakayas' ear, just like grandmother soothing a child to sleep. Ah, said Fishtail in wonder, you are beloved by the creatures. Over his shoulder, Fishtail carried a blanket, meaning that he had much to say and planned to spend the night. Father greeted him, holding him by the arms, and Nokomayas, grandmother, stirred up the fire, adding a stick there and a bit of wood in exactly the right spot to make it blaze up cheerfully. Mamma had made a good stew, filled with flaky chunks of fish, and the kettle bubbled hot and hung above the fireplace. Fishtail took off his big moose-hide mitts, and Angeline dished up the wooden bowl of soup, eager for him to sit and warm himself, because he was related as a cross-cousin, and also because he had been the husband of her dear friend. She was familiar around him, and not shy at all. She tried to cheer him up, to bring a smile to his face by teasing him gently. Father needs snowshoes all winter, but you, Angeline pointed with her lips at Fishtail, already have yours, huh? Fishtail gave a little smile, but there was still too much sadness for him to laugh. He wagged his feet. They were big, it was true, almost as big as snowshoes, as big as old Tallow's huge long ones. Aye, they come in handy, Fishtail acknowledged. If I lose a paddle, I've always got one attached. He took great gulps of the fish broth and slowly, Feeling better, he warmed to the talk with Father. They were planning this year's sugaring, a time everyone looked forward to with joy and excitement, as much as ricing, but maybe even more, for when the maple sap began to run, it meant that the warmer days, pleasant sun, and all the beauties of spring were very close at hand. The sweetness just at the raggedy end of winter, Grandma had said excitedly. She said is excited as a little girl, and her enthusiasm made everyone smile with affection. But the Creator expects us to be ready. While you talk, you men work. She herself was smoothing out a paddle to use in stirring the syrup, just the day before Father had started hollowing a peeled, smooth piece of basswood for a trough, so that the sap and the sugar could run down into a bucket. Father asked for the use of Omakayas' gun barrel flesher. She brought it out quickly from its place in the corner. She was glad to find another use for it, for Father's gift besides the unusual pleasant one of scraping hides. Taking the hide flesher in his hands, Father sharpened the end well on its sharpening stone. Holding the barrel in his strong fingers like a chisel, he hit the other end with his mallet, tapping long slices of wood away from the inside of the log. Every strip of wood he tapped from the inside. Pinch grabbed and threw into the fire. The trough deep. The trough grew smoother and deeper. Fishtail, meanwhile, smoked peacefully and looked into the leaping flames. You get to work, too, Angeline said, smiling. She tossed him a bit of venison jerky, though, for him to chew on when he finished smoking his tobacco. Now the family sugaring was the other end of the island, and when they traveled to the sugar bush, the family packed as lightly as possible. Once they arrived, they would use the frame set up from last year for their big sugaring house. There was a smaller wigwam where the tools were stored. There usually was a food cache buried last fall, filled with good things that had lain far beneath the snow. But this year Father had already made the trip to the end of the island and raided the food. To keep from starving, they had already eaten their store that during the lean moon. And when they arrived, the first thing Mamma did was unroll the reed mats for the roof of the shelter, and then the blankets, and then take out the new paddles and the cooking pot. Father dragged a big kettle and more wooden troughs and paddles from a small storage house. Anything that wasn't at the sugaring place, or anything that broke or wore out, they could make for themselves. Grandmother and Okamais arranged the food they brought. There were packets of split, dried fish, a special powdered fish, moose meat, a little deer meat that was traded for the trader, smoked fish, and a bag of dried pumpkin flowers to thicken the soup. Ooh, Grandma said we will have a good feast. And once a soup was in the making, Grandma left Angeline to stir and called Omakayas to come along and help her chop taps to open up the maple trees. The two wandered a bit until Grandmother found a good ironwood tree. She took out her sharp hatchet and expertly chopped it into the tree at regular angles. She made a series of perfect cuts down the side of the tree, and then chopped sideways and split from the tree then perfect wedges of hard ironwood. She did this until she had a huge sackful of wedges, which Okomayas lugged back to camp. For 2 days they prepared, knowing that the sap was just about ready to start running. There was a feeling there was a feeling too that time before the sap began, a quietness that had been going out of taste of winter. All that happened, and the snow and the cold, the storytelling, and the sadness too, was left behind. Omakayas opened herself to the warming wind. Before them the sweetness of the maple waited and the warmth of the sun. Omakayas. Twilight and Little Bee carted heavy rocks from the lakeshore to weigh down the makas and then hauled food for the fire. Omakayas' arms were tired, and her cousins too. They complained impatiently to each other as they hunted for the right sized stones or hauled load after load of wood in their arms, dumping it near the big kettle, which was boiling and steaming. As yet, not one taste of maple syrup, just the cold sweet sap. It was always this way before the first taste. The boiling down seemed to take so endlessly long. Pinch watched jealously, jumped on a log to observe Grandma's paddle when it came up and dipped back down again. Still not ready, still not ready. The maple syrup was still not ready. And then it was ready. Onto the surface of a big mullock filled with clean snow, Grandma dribbled a thin, dark stream of syrup. So I'm thinking of the big mullock was probably some kind of a cooking utensil, right? He grabbed while it was still a soft rope, swung the strand into his mouth, and ran, for once quiet instead of yelling, only because his mouth was stuffed. The crow was caught up in the excitement, and he jumped from foot to foot, nearly tumbling from Omakayas' shoulder as Angeline poured out more syrup and then helped Grandma ladle the rest of it into a sugaring trough. A trough is you can pour. It's a way of pouring something. You can pour. The crow pecked a little bit at the syrup, but did not seem to like the sticky feel of it on his beak, and shook his head comically. He put his head in the snow, wiped his beak back and forth, but he couldn't remove the hardening syrup. He flew up to a low branch and glared down at them, betrayed, preening his feathers, making his feathers sticky, and the syrup too. Oh my, Omakaya said, licking the dollop of thick syrup. The first taste usually made her smile, but not this time. Sadness had overwhelmed her when she tasted the sweetness. She instantly recalled that special day she spent with Niwu at the shore of the lake. On that day, long ago, last summer, she had freed him from the tight bonds of his little cradle and let him tumble out and play. And when it came time for her to put him back, she sweetened his confinement by placing her last bit of sugar on his tongue. Chickadee, my brother, she cried to Niwu under her breath. She looked around. Pinch was running and jumping, striking out with the stick and pretending to hunt doves. Grandmother was stirring the syrup, using a dancing kind of smooth movement in her arms. Mamma was putting together a stew, and Father was off somewhere with Fishtail, planning ceremonies that would be held during the sugaring, not far from the camp. Angeline looked at her and said, Grandmother, go get some more wood. Oh no, Angeline looked at her and said, Neshime, go get some more wood. So Omakayas was the only one thinking of Niwu. The knowledge made her lonely. If only she could talk to him, look into his cheerful, upslanted eyes, share with him the feeling that he never laughed at, share with him her feelings that he never laughed at, play with him in her arms. She missed him terribly, so much so that her heart seemed to drop right through her stomach with a big thud. Muffling her cries, she ran from camp straight out into the woods. Angeline was surprised. Usually her sister did not fetch wood with such enthusiasm. Huh, she called after her little sister. Watch out! Omakayas knew that she would not come back, however, and Angeline could fetch her own wood. She ran with an angry heart, breathing hard, skimming away as fast as she could. She got away from everyone before she sat down on a little patch of dry, sunny ground. At last it was all right to sob, and sob and sob, and let herself cry as much as she wanted. But the strange thing was, as soon as she sat down, she didn't feel like crying any more. She heard the song of a white-throated sparrow and was soothed by the piercing refrain. She smiled. Oh, my Niwu's spirit was comforting her. Her eyelids got heavy, the sun warmed her, and she was just about lost in the dream when she was startled by the crack of sticks and twigs, the shuffle of feet, the interested snuffling, and most of all, the commanding, unmistakable unmistakable odor of a bear, and they were with her. And standing quiet at the edge of the little spot of sun, the two young bears gazed curiously, knowingly at Omakayas. The crow flew down suddenly as though he, the little crow, had to protect her from her brothers. The two bears startled a bit at the crow's angry charge, but then shrugged and ignored him. "It's okay," said Omakayas, and the crow returned to her shoulder. The bears continued to look closely at Omakayas, peering with their dim bear eyes, taking in every dot of her scent, remembering it all, knowing. Omakayas wished that she had something to give them. She had run away from camp with nothing more than a handful of spirit tobacco in her pocket. They kept looking at her, waiting and watching. The only thing she could think of to give them, in the end, was some human advice. She decided to warn them about the other humans and the dangers they posed. "There's a woman," Omakaya said softly. "Her name is Old Tallow. She is my aunt, but you must stay away from her." The young bear's ears twitched a little. They seemed to listen closely. "Be careful, too," Omakayas went on, "when you see something better to eat than usual out in the woods. If it's hanging up out of reach, there might be a pit underneath it. That's a trap. You'll fall in and die. And guns, my brothers. Run fast from men carrying big sticks on their shoulders. Stay away from them. Don't go near the humans neither, either the natives or the white men. Stay deep in the woods. Hide if you hear Old Tallow's dogs." Omakayas reached into her pocket and took out a little handful of tobacco. She put the tobacco on the ground, and when she did, she knew she was asking for something, but she wasn't sure what it was. Words she had not expected came to her lips. "Will you give me your medicine?" She asked this, but her voice was uncertain. She really didn't know what she meant. She felt embarrassed at herself. I'm pitiful," she said, just as her grandmother um, did sometimes when praying. "I don't know anything. I want to know your medicine. I want to be like grandmother. I want to strong medicines to save my family." Tears came into Omakayas' eyes, and she could hardly see, hardly notice when the bears wheeled and silently disappeared. "Help me," she whispered to the ground. "Help me." Once she had finished talking, she lifted her face and looked around. Her bear brothers had vanished, and she felt better. She set to work gathering a huge load of dry sticks, dead branches torn off during the winter by heavy snow and ice. As she was piling the branches higher and higher, she saw on the side of the dry piece of birchwood the gray hoof of a mushroom. A tiny voice whispered in her head, a low voice muttering. When she picked up the branch, the voice grew louder, but she couldn't make out the individual words. She added the branch to her pile, bound the pile with a thong, carried it back to the camp on her shoulders. And from time to time, as she walked back to camp through the woods, she heard the small sound, a word or two muffled under the snow and leaves, and by the time she reached the sugaring camp, she felt a little bit afraid. What were those voices? What did the whispering mean? Standing in the clearing, safe, she peered into the maze of branches and undergrowth. Shining scrapes of snow lighted the ground as far as she could see. The sounds of voices, small and whispery, still floated from the depths of the woods. "What took you so long?" Angeline said, a bit annoyed. She'd burned her finger in the process of pouring some hot syrup, and she was hurting badly. "What's wrong with you?" Omakayas put down her load and told her sister that she had something important to do. "So do I," Angeline yelled back. Omakayas walked over to grandmother. She was fashioning small cones of birch bark for the sugar. She had saved a string of duckbills, too, that she'd fill with hard sugar for a special treat. Omakayas sat down next to her. "Grandmother," said Omakayas, her voice soft and troubled, "I talked to my bear brothers. I listened to them like you told me." Immediately grandmother set down her work, wiped her hands on her shirt, and brought her granddaughter over to a wide fallen log to sit with. She smoothed Omakayas' hair down on either side and looked keenly into her granddaughter's eyes and face. Wait! Intent and serious, grandmother filled her red stone pipe with tobacco. It is a sign that she was going to hear something important, and she took a long time, perfectly tamping down the pipe, which was good because during that time Omakayas had the chance to think about just what she was going to tell her grandmother. When grandmother lit the pipe and drew on it, the coals burning, the sweetness of the smoke filled the air around them and made a small, holy room in which they sat, their minds close together. I talked to them, Omakayas repeated. What did they say? I told them how to be careful of the humans. Well, that was good, said grandmother, reflecting. Unless we need meat. What did you say next? I asked my bear brothers for help, said Omakayas carefully. Well, what did they do? I don't know. What do you mean? A wreath of smoke swirled around no, grandmother's face. I asked them for medicine, said Omakayas, and when I looked up, they were gone. But as I walked back here, I heard voices. Omakayas looked quickly at her grandmother to see if she understood, and as she did, she saw grandmother only nodded. Omakayas went on talking. They were odd voices. They were all different types of voices. Did they come from the woods? Yes. Did you understand what they were saying to you? No. Neither did I, said grandmother, her voice pleased. Not at first. Oh, Machias looked at her grandmother, remembering the time she'd asked whether the plant medicines had ever spoken to her. Grandmother took the pipe from her lips and gave Omakayas a long and searching look of regard. Her eyes beamed out a quiet message of love. Grandmother understood the meaning of what had happened, understood why the voices had spoken, understood what it meant for Omakayas' future, and was proud and glad to have a granddaughter who was chosen as a healer. Even now today, I sometimes don't know what they're saying, but then I'm old and I'm getting weak, said grandmother. You are young and strong, Omakayas, and as I teach you about my medicines, you'll hear them more clearly. Do they talk to you every day? No, but often enough. Why were they talking all at once? Omakayas wondered. Grandmother thought for a while. I think they talk to each other all the time, she said, but our minds are not always peaceful enough to hear them. No, now grandmother told Omakayas that bears dig for medicine. They are a different kind of people from us. They don't use fire, but they laugh. They hold their children, they eat with the same things we do, and they treat themselves with medicine from certain plants. They are known as healers. Those in the bear clan are often good at healing others. Grandmother said all these things while stirring syrup, sugaring constantly, checking and rechecking the fires, making extra cones of black birch to hold the sugar that they would have for the year. It turned out to be a good year. The sap went down into the roots during the cold nights. It came up strong when the sun warmed the trunks during the day. The winter had started out bare, frosted the trees deeply, and then the deep snows had fallen. That was known as the best kind of year for maple sap. No thunderstorms marred the flavor of the sugar. No prayers for good weather went unanswered. Okomayas' family sugared close to Auntie Muskrat's, and her cousins flooded into the camp. A wave of flying limbs and eager faces ready for the vast games of the children played all through the trees and bush. Omakayas forgot the bears, forgot the whispering of the plants, became a cousin within a pack of cousins, roaming the camp, stealing bits of sugar, laughing at each other. The girl's cousins and her friends, Two Strike, Twilight, and Little Bee, played together in such a lively way they were a tangle of girls. She even went to sleep each night with a tiny sense of anticipation in her heart. Still, she thought of Nivu. Even her cousins could not take away that sadness. The work came first, but then lengthening light of the afternoons kept the children at play outside and kept the aunties talking, the men gossiping, and the grandmothers reminiscing about their own playing days as small children when they roamed the sugar camps. Always in the near distance, sacred drums were sounding. The sound of the drums called people to the good life, a way of kindness, love, and deep respect for all. Now, father sometimes sang to help Fishtail. Often there was a healing ceremony, a doctoring to cure the winter's illnesses. The old people talked to the young people, teaching them about the way to live in this world, the right way. Nokomis' grandmother taught also, but someone had to tend the sugar house fires, so many days she stayed inside instead of going to the ceremonies. Mama came and went, Angeline too, and sometimes they brought Omakayas to the big lodge with the endlessly burning sacred fire. So, children, the big lodge, that would be like the longhouse. Always on entering, Omakayas walked around the fire the same way the sun travels, and then she sat down in the calm of the lodge and listened to the crackle of the scented flames, waited for the throb of the drums. Pinch came too, but he never sat still, not for an instant. He dived in and out of the lodge, snagged food wherever he could get it, fell asleep on the blankets. Father kept spread in the corner near Fishtail and Day Thunder's drum. Pinch woke up, jumped up, bolted from the lodge. He was on the move all day and all night. Pinch was the quickest, the boldest, the most irritating of the boys in all the camps. Now one day while Okomayas was busy helping father and the others were at the big lodge, Pinch made himself a small bow, strung with a bit of sewing sinew and a couple arrows made from sharpened plant stalks. He sneaked through the woods, longing to make his big kill. If only a deer just his size would pass, or a moose, maybe. If not that, a fish. He would surely spear a fish with one of his arrows. Pinch trampled to the edge of the lake, and many times edged out as far as he could go on the rocky shore. There was a small margin of water now, before the ice began, and the fish were hungry. Pinch got in plenty of shots, but none of them went true. He kept having to wade into the foot or so of the freezing water to retrieve his arrows. So eventually, Pinch's attention turned back to camp. And making his way home, he resolved that he would hunt and shoot something, anything, to impress his family, especially his sisters, who thought he was a nuisance beneath notice and irritating as a fly. Hawash! Pinch yelled fiercely. He immediately thought, "Oops, wait, I missed something." Halfway back, Pinch nearly stumbled over the carcass of a dead deer. It had died not long ago, and lay cold and still in its path. "Hawa!" Pinch yelled fiercely. He had an immediate thought. Drawing his arrow out of his quiver he'd constructed for himself, he managed, though with great difficulty, to stick them into the carcass of the deer. He lodged one at the heart and one at the throat, and then he gave 4 loud, ferocious shouts. He had made his first kill. Now there would have to be a feast for him. Oh, that Pinch! "I made my first kill," he yelled as he approached the camp. Everyone turned to look at him. Thrilled with himself, he bounded forward in such intense excitement that he bumped straight into father on the side of the kettle, just as he was pouring boiling hot syrup into the sugaring trough. Pinch screamed as the syrup spilled over his feet. Even though they were protected by moccasins, much of the sap flooded in through the open top flat and burned poor Pinch badly, much worse than Angelina's finger. Pinch was not silent either, and yelled so loud that Omakayas thought the whole camp would come running for sure to his side to see what was the matter. The drums were too penetrating, though, and they blocked out the sounds, even of Pinch's pain. Gently, Father removed Pinch's moccasin. The burns were deep, and the skin was already bubbling and dangerous looking. Pinch needed a quick treatment, and most of Grandmother's medicines were back in the cabin. Father set out at once to fetch Grandmother, leaving Omakayas alone with Pinch, who howled miserably. Omakayas blocked out his cries in order to think clearly what she should do. She was trying so hard to think. Nokomis had left her small pouch in the sugar house, the one that she always carried for emergencies. The pouch contained remedies for all sorts of common problems, including burns. Omakayas remembered. She took it from the corner and sat down near Pinch to look at his foot. "Don't howl," she said to him kindly and soothing. "You'll bring all the blood to the top of your skin. It makes it worse." Whether or not that was true, it seemed to scare Pinch into making some effort to control the noise that he was making, and for the first time he looked at his big sister with trusting eyes. "Help me," he whimpered. "It hurts so badly." That was all she needed to hear. "I'm going to make it better," and uh, said Omakayas, and once she said that, this and when she said this, she was determined to do exactly that. Now, Omakayas examined him carefully. She had seen her grandmother treat burns. Omakayas looked at her and smelled the leaves and dried flowers in the birch bark packets that. Let's read that again. Omakayas looked at and smelled the leaves and dried flowers in the birch bark packets that belonged to her grandmother. Horse mint. Omakayas removed the packet and tried to remember what to do next. Pinch whimpered and gasped. Omakayas took out the stone that her grandmother used to prepare the medicines. In the center of that stone there was a hollow, and into that natural small bowl Omakayas put the leaves that smelled summery and sharp, fresh and potent, and with the other long stone that Grandma had used, Omakayas crushed them into a paste, and from that bag of deer tallow she added a yellow smear of grease, and then, forcing Pinch to lie still, she spread the paste onto his burns and propped him up against the tree. She brought him lots of maple-flavored water, stroked his forehead carefully, soothingly, and as she did this, surprisingly enough, he stopped howling. He looked up at his big sister with a gaze of intense trust, and by the time that Grandmother, Father, and the others returned, Pinch was quiet and looked alertly around, bright-eyed as the crow, and was wondering what trick he would play next. Grandfather bent over to her grandson's feet, looked carefully at what Okomayas had done. "Ho! I couldn't have done a better job," she said, pleased. Nokomayas gazed proudly at her granddaughter, and for several long moments, "My girl," she said, "you're strong and healing." "And now," said Father kindly, touching his son's prickly hair, "what was that I heard you yell at the syrup spilled onto your feet? What about your first kill?" Pinch looked at his father. He opened his mouth. He tried to tell about the deer, but somehow he just couldn't. He was amazed at himself for not lying. "Oh, it was just a mistake," he mumbled at last, looking at his sister. He said, embarrassed to her, and Meg Wetch, he said, embarrassed to be caught thanking her. It was just that his feet had hurt so badly and then felt so much better. How had she done that? So that was the very first time that Omakayas made someone better with her medicine, and through the years she would think back to that moment proudly, for her treatment worked. Pinch's feet were better in a very little time. His pain was soon gone, and he had not puckered scars. It felt very good to her to heal another human being, even if that human was Pinch. All right. So now we're kind of learning a little bit more about Omakayas as she's going along. And today her pesky little brother got into a little bit of trouble and burned himself. And it was Omakayas that was able to um, treat him medically, right, with what she knew on how to do it. And he seemed to get better really quickly. So it seems that um, maybe Omakayas has a special talent. So tomorrow's chapter is called One Horn's Protection. And remember, One Horn was that it was the deer that fed the family. So I'm wondering, I'm so curious about what this is going to be about. So tomorrow we will read the next and the last two chapters of this book. I can't wait to see what happens.